It's May 2020. A once-in-a-century pandemic is shutting the world down. But in the midst of that chaos, a video of a black man pinned under a white police officer's knee goes viral. This was George Floyd. Within a day, riots began and soon mass protests, many violent, spread across the globe. Ironically, even here in Australia, while we were locked down and businesses were shuttered, the government suddenly decided the virus could take a break so people could march. Viruses, as we know, can be quite partisan. Fast forward to 2025, Iryna Zarutska, a Ukrainian refugee who had escaped drones and missile strikes, was brutally murdered on a train in Charlotte. But this time, the reaction was very telling. She was only 23 years old, a Ukrainian refugee who had made it safely to Charlotte after escaping a war zone, just trying to build a new life. One night on the city's light rail after her shift at a pizza place, she crossed paths with a man named DeCarlos Brown, a repeat offender with a long criminal record and a history of untreated schizophrenia. Police happened to be nearby and arrested him almost immediately. On paper, it was a shocking crime with all the ingredients to dominate the headlines. A young refugee, public transit, a dangerous man who had slipped through the cracks of the system. But strangely, it didn't. For days, coverage barely left Charlotte. Local outlets carried the story, but the rest? Silence. Major papers? Nothing. Unless you lived in North Carolina, you probably wouldn't even have known her name. And naturally, it stayed that way for a number of days, of course, until the surveillance footage went absolutely viral. The senselessness of the crime, how helpless and perhaps how unaware Irina was, the reaction from the passengers near her, the imagery honestly haunted me. It felt surreal. I didn't know this girl, but it genuinely felt like watching a family member getting killed. But what came next was perhaps downright evil. While many on the right and perhaps even on the centre were outraged and shared their thoughts on places like social media, you almost got the sense that there was very little interest from the left. When their larger outlets finally moved, the coverage wasn't really about Irina. It was about the reaction to Irina. Axios framed it as, "The grisly Charlotte video fuels MAGA's crime message." Not who was Irina and how did the system fail her, but how the right is using this. The Guardian went with, "The US right capitalizes on the fatal stabbing of a Ukrainian refugee." Again, the headline centers politics over the person, the meta-narrative, not the murder. And for many days after the outrage, the New York Times had done zero reporting on the one issue that was the primary talking point in America. And when they finally did, surprise, surprise, a gruesome murder in North Carolina ignites a firestorm on the right. Now, think back just a few years to George Floyd. His death was an instant spectacle. Within hours, CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post were wall to wall, not just covering what happened, but flooding us with symbolism, commentary, think pieces, cultural reckonings, you name it. Entire corporations rebranded themselves overnight in the name of justice. Billions were spent on racial justice initiatives. It was one of the fastest mass mobilizations of outrage the modern world has ever seen. And yet here, with Irina, the silence was deafening. Why the difference? I don't think we can ignore the racial dynamics, honestly. George Floyd's story matched perfectly with the narrative many media institutions were primed to amplify. A black man, a white cop, America's original sin of racism. It fit neatly into a worldview already waiting to be confirmed. But Irina's case pointed in the opposite direction. A young white refugee killed by a black man with a violent record in a Democrat-run city. That story doesn't flatter the narrative. It raises uncomfortable questions about crime, race, immigration, and the failures of a justice system that repeatedly releases dangerous offenders. So instead of being amplified, it was being downplayed or reframed as a story about the politics of outrage. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, give it a like, subscribe if you haven't, and consider signing up on Patreon. And look, we need to be honest here. We've been bombarded with this idea that white people, no matter who they are or where they come from, carry some kind of built-in privilege. But the way that idea is applied has a darker side. It erases the ability to see white victims as human beings who deserve sympathy and protection. It flattens them into symbols of privilege, instead of people with the same right to safety as anyone else. Even in this case, a refugee working a minimum wage job trying to build a life in a brand new country. Not leeching off welfare like so many in Europe, but actually earning her place. Even if she was fleeing Putin's missiles and drones, watching her people die on the front lines in the most horrific ways imaginable, none of that seems to matter, because in today's political climate, her skin color diminishes her death. And to be honest, if it weren't for Elon Musk's ex, I don't think anyone outside of Charlotte would have even heard of this murder. That alone tells you how much the mainstream wants to avoid stories that clash with their narrative. And governments, as you know, all over the West are starting to censor what you can see too. That's exactly why I use Proton VPN and why I think you should too. They're based in Switzerland, outside the reach of US, EU, UK and Australian law. They don't keep logs and are built by the same team behind Proton Mail. When the UK passed its surveillance laws, Proton VPN became the #1 app on the App Store. Their stealth protocol beats censorship firewalls. Secure Core routes your traffic through privacy-first countries, and NetShield blocks trackers before they ever reach you. I've used Proton Mail since Australia announced sweeping surveillance laws last year, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it's now essential. If you want to protect your privacy and support this channel, hit the link below to get up to 60% off Proton VPN. Now, when you actually look at the numbers behind violent crime, it becomes obvious why. Because despite all the rhetoric, the data paints a very different picture. According to the Bureau of Justice's Victimization Survey, roughly 2.4 million violent crimes between 2017 and 2021 involved black offenders and white victims. By contrast, there were about 370,000 incidents of white offenders targeting black victims. FBI homicide data for 2019 tells a similar story. 566 black on white killings compared to 246 white on black. And let's not forget, the vast majority of all violent crime in America is actually intra-racial. Around 81% of white victims are killed by white offenders and 91% of black victims by black offenders. These are the stats they would rather you never hear, because they shatter the facade, not just in America, but in the narratives exported right here to Australia as well. And if the stats weren't damning enough, look at how the system actually operates. DeCarlos Brown had been arrested 14 times. 14! And every time, nothing meaningful was done. Even when a court ordered a mental health evaluation, it's not clear it ever happened. Yet, he was still out, roaming free until he finally killed someone. And this is in a country where the left never stops lecturing about criminal justice reform. They'll march and scream about over-policing, but when repeat offenders like this slip through the cracks over and over again, who pays the price? Ordinary people, refugees, commuters on their way home. Whenever something like this happens, even in Australia, my mind always goes to El Salvador these days. You've got Bukele locking up gang members by the tens of thousands, and suddenly the murder rate drops to one of the lowest in Latin America. People can walk the streets at night again. Is it harsh? Yes, but it worked. Meanwhile in America, a man can rack up 14 arrests and still be free to take an innocent life. At the end of the day, crime follows incentives. If offenders know they'll be back on the street after a slap on the wrist, they act out accordingly. But if the price of stepping out of line is decades behind bars, or never seeing daylight again, the calculation changes overnight. That's game theory in real time. The rules of the game change, and so does the behavior. Regardless of all criminal justice bullshit the left promotes where crime, especially the most violent kind, doesn't appear to change, a country like El Salvador shows us that actually, you can almost change it overnight. Iryna's story is another example of how the progressive model for preventing violent crime collapses in practice. So let's just be honest, Iryna's death didn't matter to them. Not because it wasn't horrific, not because it didn't deserve coverage, but because it didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. A white refugee killed by a black repeat offender in a Democrat city. That's where we are. Justice isn't blind anymore, it's selective. And if you don't fit the story they want to tell, your life, your death, your name, none of that matters. Hey, you made it to the end. As always, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and give the video a thumbs up. It really helps. A massive thank you to all my channel members and Patreon supporters. You're the reason I can keep making content like this. If you want to support the channel, consider joining the crew. just hit the join button below or head over to Patreon. Even a small pledge goes a long way, and I would genuinely love to have you on board. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.